9 days before Christmas, in December of 1979, an 18-year-old girl named Michelle Martinko drove her family's car to a shopping mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was the ordinary errand of an ordinary evening. She had a winter coat waiting for her. Her mother had put it on layaway, and Michelle went to pick it up. That was all. A high school senior, at a mall, at the height of the holiday shopping season, buying a coat. There is nothing about that evening that should have ended the way it did. She never came home. In the early hours of the next morning, Michelle Martinko was found in her family's car, in the mall parking lot, stabbed to death. And when investigators tried to understand why, they ran headfirst into the detail that would define this case and haunt the community for 4 decades. There was no why. She had not been robbed. Her money was still there. She had not been sexually assaulted. There was no jealous boyfriend, no enemy, no debt, no connection anyone could find between Michelle and whoever had done this. She had been attacked, savagely, in a public parking lot on a busy night, apparently by a stranger, apparently for no reason at all. And that is one of the most terrifying things a murder can be, because if there's no reason, then there's no way to see it coming, and no way to know who's next. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones that stay cold for decades until a single overlooked clue finally speaks, subscribe to Decades Cold, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. But Michelle Martinko did not go quietly. She fought her attacker with everything an 18-year-old had, and in that struggle, something happened that the killer could not have understood the significance of, because the science that would make it matter did not yet exist. His own knife slipped, it cut him, and he left a few drops of his own blood behind, on Michelle's dress and on the gear shift of the car, mingled with the evidence of what he'd done. For 39 years, that blood could not tell anyone who he was. It just sat, preserved, in an evidence file, waiting. And when the world finally built the tools to read it, that blood traced a path through a family tree, past a distant cousin who had never heard Michelle's name, and landed on a man no one had ever suspected. This is the story of Michelle Martinko, forever 18, and the single mistake a killer made when his own blade turned against him. Michelle Marie Martinko was 18 years old, a senior at John F. Kennedy High School in Cedar Rapids, and she was, by every account, exactly the kind of kid you'd want your own child to be. She was popular, in the genuine sense, not because she was cruel or exclusive, but because people liked being around her. She sang, she was involved in her school's choir, she was planning her future, with her sights set on Iowa State University. She was a girl standing right at the doorway of her adult life, with all of it still in front of her, everything still possible. Her family loved her the way families love a bright, good kid who's about to leave the nest. Her sister, Janelle, would speak years later about the particular way the loss stayed woven into their lives, how it wasn't so much a single date on the calendar as a feeling that came around every holiday season, always with them, because that's when it happened. That's the cruelty of the timing. Michelle was killed in the middle of December, in the middle of the warmest, most family-centered stretch of the year, and so for the people who loved her, the season and the grief became permanently fused. Every Christmas, forever, would carry this. And here is a small detail that tells you something about who she was, and that makes what happened even harder to bear. The reason she was at that mall at all was mundane and sweet. Her mother had bought her a winter coat and put it on layaway, that old system where you pay a little at a time until it's yours. Michelle went to the mall that night to collect it. She had cash from her mother in her purse. She was, in other words, doing one of the most ordinary, wholesome things a teenager does in December, picking up a warm coat for the winter, with money her mom had given her. It's the kind of errand that is supposed to be utterly forgettable. It's the kind of errand that a parent sends a child on without a flicker of worry. And it became the last thing Michelle Martinko ever did. Hold on to who she was as we go forward. A real 18-year-old, with a voice and a future and a family who adored her. Because the horror of this case is precisely how random it was. Michelle did nothing wrong. She made no mistake. She simply went to get her coat. What happened to her could have happened to anyone's daughter, on any ordinary night, and that is exactly why it frightened an entire community for 40 years. The night of December 19th, 1979, began, for Michelle, with something happy and completely normal. She attended a school banquet, an event for her choir, a gathering of classmates and friends near the end of the semester, the kind of warm, low-stakes evening that fills a high schooler's December. When it was over, she got into her family's car, a 1972 Buick Electra, a big Iowa family sedan, and she drove to Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids to run her errand. She got there in the evening, sometime after 6:30, and the mall that night was exactly what you'd expect a mall to be 9 days before Christmas. Busy, full of shoppers, full of light, full of people. This was not some deserted, sinister place. It was one of the most public, crowded, ordinary environments imaginable, at one of the busiest times of the year. Michelle even ran into people she knew. A friend who had known her since elementary school later testified that he and some buddies had stopped by the mall that evening before heading off to see a movie, and that they'd crossed paths with Michelle, who told them she was there to pick up her coat. Just a normal exchange between teenagers on a December night, one of the last ordinary conversations of her life. She got her coat, and at some point after that, she walked back out into the parking lot, toward her family's Buick, to drive home. And that is where the ordinary evening ended, and where the darkness this case is known for began. Somewhere in that parking lot, in the middle of a busy holiday shopping night, someone approached Michelle Martinko. Later reconstruction of the case suggested the attacker may have come at her under some small, disarming pretext, the kind of everyday approach a person doesn't think twice about, someone asking a simple question. Whatever the pretext was, it ended in violence. And despite how public the place was, despite the crowds and the lights and the coming and going of holiday shoppers, no one saw the attack. No one heard it in a way that stopped it. Michelle was, somehow, alone with her killer in the middle of a crowd. When Michelle didn't come home, her parents did what any parents would do as the hours crept past. They grew frightened, and around 2 o'clock in the morning, they reported her missing. Not long after, at around 4 a.m., police located the family's Buick Electra, still parked at Westdale Mall, and inside it they found Michelle. I'm going to tell you what happened to her plainly and then move on, because the specifics of this kind of violence do not honor her, and dwelling on them serves no one but the curious. Michelle had been stabbed a great many times. The attack was ferocious, sustained, and close. The wounds and their number told investigators this was not a quick, panicked act, but a prolonged and brutal one. She suffered a fatal wound to the heart, and she died from blood loss inside the car. She was 18 years old. But even in the middle of that horror, the evidence told investigators something important about Michelle. She had defensive wounds on her hands. Defensive wounds are the marks left when a person fights, when they grab at the blade, when they throw their hands up, when they refuse to simply be a victim. Michelle Martinko fought her killer hard, with her bare hands, in the dark of that parking lot. And that fight, that refusal, mattered enormously, because it's during a struggle like that, hand to hand, blade in play, both people moving violently, that a killer is most likely to slip and to bleed. Michelle's fight is very likely the reason her killer left his own blood behind. In her final minutes, without any way of knowing it, she captured the one piece of evidence that would eventually name him. And then, there was the detail that made the whole thing so bewildering to investigators. Michelle had not been robbed. The cash her mother had given her was still there. She had not been sexually assaulted. Nothing about the crime pointed to any of the usual motives. Not money, not sex, not a personal grudge. She was a well-liked teenager with no dangerous entanglements, killed with extraordinary violence, and then simply left in her car, with her belongings, for no discernible reason. That absence of a motive is the black hole at the center of this case. It gave investigators nowhere to start. A murder investigation, at its core, usually runs on motive. You ask who benefited, who was angry, who had a history with the victim, who stood to gain. You follow the money, the relationships, the grudges. Detectives are trained to pull on those threads because, in the vast majority of killings, one of them leads to the killer. Someone almost always had a reason. The Martinko case handed investigators none of that. There was no robbery to trace, no sexual assault to build a profile from, no jilted lover, no family conflict, no shady business dealing. She was 18, a high school senior with a normal life. When the motive is missing, the entire machinery of a traditional investigation loses its traction. Detectives were left with a savage murder and no reason for it, which pointed toward the most difficult kind of case there is to solve. A random one. A stranger. Someone who crossed Michelle's path for the first and only time in that parking lot, killed her, and vanished back into a crowd of holiday shoppers, connected to her by nothing at all. And that is precisely why a random murder is so terrifying and so hard to solve. The threads that normally lead to a killer don't exist, because the killer had no relationship to the victim to leave a thread. He wasn't in her life. He wasn't in anyone's list of people to check. He was, from the investigation's point of view, a ghost with no reason to be anywhere near this girl, which meant there was no logical path from Michelle outward to him. Detectives worked the case hard. They pursued leads, chased possibilities, kept the file active, but without a motive to organize the search, and without the forensic tools that were still decades away, they had no way to convert the evidence they did have into a name. So the years passed, and the community of Cedar Rapids lived with something heavy and unresolved. The knowledge that a teenage girl had been butchered in the middle of a crowded mall on a December night, and that whoever had done it had simply walked away, and might be anyone, anywhere, still out there. Michelle Martinko became a name that people in that part of Iowa carried, a wound that never fully closed. The case went cold, but it was never, quite, forgotten. Here is what the killer left behind, and what he almost certainly never realized he'd left. In the frenzy of the attack, during that hand-to-hand fight Michelle put up, the killer's own weapon had turned on him. A knife, used in a violent, close, chaotic struggle, is a dangerous thing to hold, and at some point his grip failed him, or the blade slipped, and he cut himself. He bled, and a few drops of his blood ended up where they should not have been, on Michelle's black dress and on the gear shift of the family's Buick. At the scene in 1979, that blood was collected as evidence. But think about what could actually be done with a bloodstain in 1979. Blood typing, at best, the ability to say it belonged to someone with a certain blood type, which narrows a suspect pool to a huge fraction of the population and identifies precisely no one. There was no DNA profiling. There was no way to take those few drops and derive from them a unique genetic identity, let alone match it to a specific human being. So the killer's blood, like so much crucial evidence in the cases we cover, was simultaneously the most important thing in the file and, at that moment, nearly useless. It was his signature, his identity, sitting right there, written in a language no one on earth could yet read. But it was preserved. And that word, preserved, is the quiet hero of case after case on this channel. Someone, following procedure, collected that blood and stored it, and it was kept. Through all the years the case sat cold, through decades of the file gathering dust, the physical evidence was maintained. And that single fact is what kept this case alive in a way nothing else could have. Because a preserved bloodstain doesn't age out. It doesn't forget. It doesn't lose its nerve or move away or die. It waits, chemically patient, exactly as it was on the night it was left, for the world to invent a way to make it speak. Michelle's killer had left his own name at the scene, in blood. He just had the good fortune of leaving it 39 years before anyone could read it. For a cold case to be solved, two things have to happen. The science has to advance far enough to read the old evidence, and someone has to care enough to go back and try. The evidence can't test itself. It needs a human being who refuses to let a decades-old murder stay buried under the weight of everything else a police department is dealing with. In the Martinko case, that person came in the form of a cold case investigator who, in the mid-2000s, went back into the old files and looked at them with fresh eyes. Around 2006, that investigator, reviewing the case, focused in on the blood, the unidentified blood that had been recovered back in 1979, presumed to belong to the killer. And in doing so, he found something that is quietly maddening, and also, in the end, redemptive. The blood scrapings taken from the car's gear shift had, at some earlier point, been tested, but the results had never been fully pursued. The thread had been picked up and then, for whatever reason, set back down. This happens in cold cases more than anyone would like. A piece of evidence is examined, its moment passes, resources shift elsewhere, and it slips back into the file, waiting for someone to notice it again. This investigator noticed. He pushed the blood evidence forward into the modern era, and the lab did what 1979 could not. It developed an actual DNA profile from the killer's blood. A full, unique genetic signature, drawn from both the gear shift and Michelle's dress. For the first time, the police had the killer reduced to a precise genetic identity. Not a blood type, not a vague description. A profile as unique as a fingerprint, belonging to exactly one man alive. And they did the obvious next thing. They ran that profile against the criminal DNA databases, the way you would in any modern case. And they got nothing. No match. The killer, whoever he was, had never been convicted of a crime that put his DNA into the system. He wasn't a career criminal with a record. He was, apparently, an ordinary person, which fit the terrible logic of a motiveless murder, but also meant that the standard database search, the workhorse of the modern cold case, had just hit a wall. The DNA was perfect, and it still pointed at no one. To go further, the investigation would need a technique that didn't search for the killer at all. That technique had arrived by the late 2010s, and regular viewers of this channel know it well: forensic genetic genealogy. The idea, to recap it briefly, is elegant. The criminal databases only contain known offenders, so if your killer isn't one, they're useless. But the public genealogy databases, the ones where ordinary people upload their DNA to trace their ancestry and find relatives, contain millions of law-abiding people, and some of them are inevitably related, however distantly, to your killer. So instead of searching for the murderer directly, you search for his family, and then you build the family tree back down to him. Investigators took the DNA profile developed from the killer's blood and uploaded it into a public genealogy database, and it returned what these searches return: a distant relative, a cousin far out on the branches of a family tree, who had voluntarily put their own DNA into the system for reasons that had nothing to do with a murder in Iowa, and who had no idea that their genetic information was about to help solve a 39-year-old crime. From that distant cousin, genealogists did the painstaking work of building the tree, tracing the lines forward, generation by generation, narrowing the field of possible relatives who could match the profile. And the tree closed down onto a small, specific target: 3 brothers in Iowa. The killer, the DNA said, was almost certainly one of these 3 men. It's worth pausing on how astonishing that is. A few drops of blood, left by a bleeding stranger in a parking lot in 1979, evidence that had named no one for 39 years, had just been narrowed, through the branches of a family tree, to 3 brothers in the same state where the crime occurred. 2 of the brothers were examined and eliminated, and that left one. One man out of everyone alive on Earth, whom the science now pointed at as the person who had stabbed Michelle Martinko to death in that Buick. His name was Jerry Lynn Burns. But, and this is the rule this channel comes back to again and again, genetic genealogy is a lead, not a conviction. The family tree pointed hard at Jerry Burns. It did not, by itself, prove he did it. To do that, investigators needed Burns's own DNA, taken directly, and matched cleanly against the blood from the crime scene, and they needed to get it without alerting him. So investigators did what has become the standard final move in these cases. They watched Jerry Burns, and they waited for him to leave a piece of himself behind in a public place. Burns lived in Manchester, Iowa, a small town not far from Cedar Rapids, where he was a local business owner, an unremarkable, established member of the community. In 2018, a surveillance operation followed him, waiting for the moment he would discard something they could legally collect and test. That moment came at a restaurant, a pizza ranch in Manchester. Burns ate a meal, and when he was done, he did the most ordinary thing in the world. He threw away his trash, including a drinking straw he'd used. Once he left it behind, that straw was, in the eyes of the law, abandoned, and the DNA on it was fair game. Investigators recovered the straw, and the saliva on it went to the lab to be compared against the blood the killer had shed in 1979. It matched. The DNA from Jerry Burns's discarded straw was an exact match to the blood left at the scene of Michelle Martinko's murder. There it was, the thing 39 years and every previous investigator had been unable to produce. A direct, undeniable physical link between a specific living man and the blood the killer had bled during the attack. And then investigators did something with a deliberate, almost solemn symbolism. They arrested Jerry Lynn Burns on December 19, 2018, the 39th anniversary, to the exact day of the night Michelle Martinko was killed. 39 years to the day after she drove to that mall to pick up a coat and never came home, the man whose blood she had captured in her final fight was taken into custody. And here is where the case delivers its final, chilling confirmation of the thing that had frightened people for 4 decades. Who was Jerry Burns? He was, in every ordinary sense, a nobody in this story. He was a local business owner, a married man, an established figure in a small Iowa town, someone his neighbors and customers and friends knew as a regular, unremarkable member of the community. When he was arrested, the people who knew him described being utterly shocked. The family of the suspect publicly called it a complete shock. This was not a man anyone had ever looked at twice. And crucially, he had no connection to Michelle Martinko. None. He maintained, even after his arrest, that he had never met her, and the investigation bore that out. There was no relationship, no prior contact, no thread linking Jerry Burns to Michelle in life. In 1979, he had been a young man, roughly in his mid-20s, and on some December night he had encountered an 18-year-old girl he did not know in a mall parking lot and killed her, savagely, for reasons that have never been explained and may not be explainable. And then he had gone home and lived an ordinary life, running his business, being a neighbor, growing older, for 39 years, less than 2 hours' drive from where he'd left her. This is the truth that makes the Martinko case so uniquely disturbing, and it's the exact fear that the no-motive mystery had promised from the very beginning. The reason no thread led from Michelle to her killer is that there was no thread. The reason no motive could be found is that the motive, whatever dark thing drove him, lived entirely inside a stranger who had no business being anywhere near her. He was not a monster who lurked visibly at the edges of her world. He was a regular guy from the next town over who did something monstrous once and then hid inside a completely normal life for the rest of the century. That's not a comforting resolution. It's a reminder that the person capable of a random, motiveless act of horror can look exactly like anyone, like a neighbor, a business owner, a familiar face at the local restaurant. It took his own blood and a family tree to pull him out of that ordinary life and finally name him. Jerry Burns went to trial in early 2020. The case was moved to Davenport, Iowa, to find an impartial jury, and it was, in its own right, a landmark. Because the Martinko case was among the earliest in the country in which a murder built on forensic genetic genealogy was tested in front of a jury, and in which the defense fought hard over the DNA and how it had been obtained, Burns's lawyers argued that police should have needed a search warrant before scooping up his discarded straw and testing his DNA, that he had a right to privacy in what he'd left behind. It was a serious legal question, and one that the rise of this new science was forcing courts across the country to confront. But at the center of the trial, cutting through the legal arguments, was the blood. The prosecution walked the jury back through time, to a December night in 1979, and laid out the physical evidence. That Michelle's killer had been cut during the attack, that his blood was on her dress and on the gear shift, that a DNA profile built from that blood matched Jerry Burns, and that Burns had no innocent explanation for how his blood had come to be there. The defense insisted the DNA didn't tell the whole story. The jury disagreed. On February 24, 2020, they found Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He appealed, centering his challenge on the discarded straw and the question of whether the police had violated his privacy in collecting it. And in March of 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court rejected that argument and upheld his conviction, ruling that once Burns tossed the straw in the trash at that restaurant, he had abandoned any reasonable expectation of privacy over it, that he had made no effort to keep it private, and that it was fair for anyone, including police, to collect. It's a ruling that helps settle, in that state, one of the central legal questions surrounding this entire method, that the DNA you leave behind on the things you throw away is no longer yours to protect. For the Martinko family, for Michelle's sister, and the people who had carried this for 40 years, it meant the conviction was final. After 4 decades, it was truly, permanently over. The murder of Michelle Martinko leaves us with a few things worth carrying, and they cut deeper than the usual satisfaction of a solved case. The first is about fear, and about how this particular case earned the grip it held on a community for 40 years. Most murders, as terrible as they are, come with a kind of grim logic, a motive, a relationship, a reason that, once understood, lets the rest of us feel a small, false comfort that it couldn't happen to us. The Martinko case offered no such comfort. A well-liked teenager, doing nothing but picking up a coat in a crowded mall on an ordinary December night, was murdered by a stranger for no reason anyone could ever name. That's the fear that lived in Cedar Rapids for 4 decades. Not the fear of a specific monster, but the fear that the monster could be anyone, and that the horror could find anyone's daughter on any ordinary night. The second thing is the one this whole channel keeps proving, and this case proves it as cleanly as any we've told. Michelle's killer left his own blood at the scene in 1979, and it named him in 2018. Nothing about that blood changed in 39 years. What changed was the world's ability to read it, and whether anyone was still willing to try. The evidence was patient. It waited, exactly as it was, through decades of dead ends, until a cold case investigator pulled the thread again, and a new science could finally decode it. And there's a deeper justice in how it happened. Michelle's killer was undone by the very violence he inflicted. His own blade, turning on him during the fight she put up, spilling the blood that would one day convict him. In a real sense, Michelle's refusal to die quietly is what caught him. She fought hard enough to take a piece of him with her, and she held on to it, in a way, for 39 years, until the world could use it. Michelle Marie Martinko was 18 years old, a senior with a good voice and collegiate plans, and a coat her mom had bought her for the winter. She should have driven home that night, and grown up, and had the whole long, ordinary life that was hers to have. Instead, her family learned to fold their grief into every holiday season, and to hold on to her as she was, forever 18. It took 39 years, a preserved bloodstain, a distant cousin, and a discarded straw. But the stranger who took her from them was finally pulled out of his ordinary life and made to answer for it. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.